Hello, cognitive scientists. I'm David Harrison, and I teach linguistics at Swarthmore College. The field of study that I would like to talk with you about today is something that I've come to call environmental linguistics, which is a new term, but it explores many of the same topics as more established fields such as cognitive anthropology. In brief, environmental linguistics explores the way in which the human mind names, categorizes, and describes the environment using our most important cultural tool, which is language. And by environment, I mean not just plants and animals, but also landscapes, social structures, sounds, water, wind, heavenly bodies, numbers, time, and space. The main scientific technique I use in my work is called participant observation, which means that I visit a culture, I live with the people, and take part in as many daily activities as I can, observing, learning to speak the language, taking notes, interviewing people. The data that I collect is qualitative, not quantitative, and it is the intellectual property of the community, not the scientists who collected it. The people I work with are not human subjects, but are rather my co-authors and collaborators, and together we create things like talking dictionaries and digital archives to preserve their languages. I first became aware of the need for environmental linguistics and the environmental dimension of cognition when, as a graduate student, I spent a year in Siberia living with nomadic yak herders. It was not something that my studies in theoretical linguistics had prepared me for. A field linguist is trained to do phonetic transcription, morphological, semantic, syntactic analysis, and to apply abstract theories of how language works, or language universals. As a linguist, I was not trained to talk about shit, or to discover that Tuvans have two completely different words for yak dung, depending on whether it's still wet and smelly and not to be touched, or it has been dried and processed and is ready to be brought inside the yurt and used in a cook stove, and it's considered sanitary. Living with the nomads in Siberia, I quickly learned that the linguistic questions I'd been trained to ask were all boring and uninteresting to my host family. What consumed them and what they wanted to talk about all day, from morning to night, was the nature and environment that surrounded us. And so as I began to learn the Tuvan language, I realized that they had highly sophisticated mental tools that were entirely absent, not only in the vocabulary of my native language, English, and other languages I know, such as Russian, but absent from our worldview, our concept of how the world is organized and structured, how it makes sense. As any bilingual person has experienced, when you're translating in your head or out loud, it's not just that you can't translate some words directly from one language to another. It's that entire concepts have to be made up on the fly because they're missing. Here are three domains of knowledge that I explored among the Tuvan nomads that can serve as examples. The first is animals, the second is space, and the third is time. First, in talking about wild and domestic animals, I learned that Tuvans have many more names than I had ever heard. Using individual words, not descriptive phrases, they can describe the life stages, dozens of distinct colors and patterns, fertility, usefulness of animals, as well as taboo names and spiritual or symbolic words for animals like the bear. They can express the concept, my 3-year-old castrated rideable male reindeer, in a single word, which in Tuvan is charim. Secondly, space or landscapes. Tuvans, like many indigenous cultures from the Himalayas to Pacific Islands, encode topography and space in ways that are precise and useful to them as a survival tool. Knowing such systems ensures that nomads, no matter how far they may migrate, are never lost, and ocean navigators, no matter how far they may sail, always return to their home island. Tuvans are oriented to river systems, So in order to say go in their language, you must reference the direction of the current in the nearest river relative to your own trajectory. They can say a single word, choktar, which means in English you would need an entire sentence. It means I am walking in a direction that is upstream according to the current in the nearest river. Thirdly, time. Tuvans, like many indigenous people, were able to precisely track and reckon time without clocks or calendars, using interlocking cycles of natural events that they had observed over millennia. Like many cultures, they had a 13-month lunar calendar that was more precise than our 365-day solar calendar, and it did not need to be synced up every 4 years with a leap day because it stayed in sync. This time reckoning technology allowed them to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth, but most of these calendrical systems have now been lost. So the missing vocabulary I experienced turned out not to be missing at all. In fact, it was omnipresent if you happen to speak the language that is adapted to the environment where you find yourself. If you speak a language like English, which is remarkably disconnected from the natural environment, of course, you can still express these concepts, but the language does not provide them to you in a ready-made package, and you may need an entire sentence. I could give many more examples, and I would encourage you as you explore and learn languages to be on the lookout for these kinds of examples and ask yourself, what is the relevance to cognitive science and to our understanding of the mind? The big mystery for me is not whether culture influences cognition, because there's voluminous evidence that it does, but to what extent and in what areas of cognition.